Once you've been playing airsoft for a while, I'm sure you're going to come across a situation where either your gun's velocity is going to be too high or too low for the field that you're playing at, since a lot of fields have upper level restrictions on your velocity, as well as there's certain situations where you'll be outdoors and you want a higher velocity in order to be competitive. Either way, you're going to need to be able to adjust the velocity on your gun. Now, of course, the glib answer to this problem is just go out and get yourself a Polar Star. Then all you have to do is just adjust your velocity by changing the regulator settings, and you can get whatever velocity you want, which of course is true, but you know, in today's Build Back Better economy, not a lot of people have the extra $1,000 to plunk down on an HPA rig, so you know, we're left to fend for ourselves with our good old-fashioned electric AEGs. And it's just a matter of changing out the springs, but the problem is there's not a lot of information out there on what spring you need to get what velocity. So today's video is going to be centered on picking out the proper spring to get the velocity that you're looking for. So I've been doing a fair amount of research on this topic, and suffice it to say, there's a lot of information out on the internet that is out there that you can find, but you need to sort of preface that with the fact that there's a lot of variables that go into determining what velocity you're going to get from an airsoft gun based on a number of factors that are going on within the gearbox and the barrel and a number of other things. So we're going to have to break down some of that stuff so that you're able to get you know, a more correct answer to the problem. So the first thing you're going to need to do is figure out what you're working with your current setup. So there's a number of variables that you're going to have to figure out for yourself. First thing is, what kind of spring is in the gun and what velocity are you currently getting? Now, as far as your velocity goes, all you need is a chronograph. If you don't have one, you can just go to a shop like this and have your gun chronographed. But it's necessary to know, first of all, what velocity are you getting to start with. Second variable you need to know is what spring is in the gun. Now, if it's a stock factory gun, then odds are it's probably an M100 spring, although that's not always so. So it's a good idea to be able to figure out how much weight does it take to compress the spring that's in the gun. Easiest way to do that is to leave the gearbox put together. In fact, you could leave the gearbox in the receiver, just remove the grip. First thing you're going to want to do is trip the anti-reversal latch. That way the piston can move freely inside of the gearbox. And then you're going to need some way of weighing it. I've got here just a regular postal scale. You can use a bathroom scale if you want to. And all I'm doing is putting like a T-handled Allen wrench in it, and I'm seeing how many pounds does it take to fully compress the spring. So you want to get that variable, write that down. So those are the first two things we need to know. One other important piece of information we're going to need is what kind of barrel are you dealing with your current setup. We need to know about the inner barrel, not the outer barrel. So you're going to have to remove the barrel and measure it, figure out what is the length of it, as well as what is the diameter of the bore. Is this a standard bore or is it a tight bore? With tight bore barrels, most of the time the manufacturers will engrave on the barrel what it is, whether it's a 6.01, 6.02, and so on. But those factors are necessary for us to know in order to recommend what spring you need to get a particular velocity. One other thing you may want to determine is whether or not you have thrust bearings on your gun. Thrust bearings are little ball bearing sets that sit on either the piston head or on the spring guide. Essentially, they allow the spring to twist smoothly as it compresses and decompresses. It also has an effect on your velocity in that it takes up space on the spring and compresses the spring a little bit more, so you end up getting higher velocities if you have these bearing sets, these thrust bearings on it. It's also critical to know whether or not you have it, because in some instances, like in Lancer, I know for a fact, sometimes their thrust bearings take up so much space that full-size springs will not compress fully inside of it, and the gun will just essentially lock because there's not enough room for a full-size spring to compress inside of the piston. So it's important to know that, because I've seen guns where it's stripped out gears because it's trying to compress the spring all the way. There's not enough room to do it, and then it ends up stripping a gear off. And in a cheaper gearbox like a Lancer, where they have very soft metal for the gears, it can strip them out pretty easily. So it's important to determine those things. So with changing out springs on an electric gearbox, your gearbox is essentially going to fall into one of two categories. Either it's going to be the standard type, in which you have to fully disassemble the gearbox in order to get the spring out, or it's going to have what they call a quick release spring guide on the rear of the gearbox. Quick release is not the best description of it, because usually in most cases you still have to disassemble a fair amount of the gun to get to the spring, but for the sake of argument we're going to call this a quick release and this a standard gearbox. Now, I don't need to tell you that all gearboxes are not created equally. I'm sure you're well aware that some manufacturers build them way better than others. So it's important to know when you are increasing the power of your spring, you need to make sure that the other components inside of the gearbox are going to be able to cope with the additional stress that you're going to be putting on them. In general, I tell people if you're going up to an M120, you can usually use your stock parts. Above an M120, you're probably going to want to start to upgrade some of the other internal components inside of the gearbox. Some of the things I would recommend is if your piston has a plastic gear tooth system on it, I would recommend going up to a full metal rack or full metal gear tooth on it so that it's able to handle the additional stress. Your gear set, you may want to go to a higher torque gear set or just a better made gear set that's not using cast parts, that it's, you know, steel forged gears that are able to handle more torque on them. You're also going to want to probably upgrade your motor to a high torque motor, because it's going to take more power to compress that spring. And of course, because you're drawing more power, you're going to need a larger battery. So those are some things to keep in mind, you know, that it's not necessarily a simple thing of just putting a spring into the gun. If you're doing higher velocities and higher power springs, it's going to probably require some additional upgrades to the gun in order to handle it. It may work for a while without those parts, but it'll probably end up stripping out a gear or, you know, burning out a motor. So it's important to you know, think ahead when you're doing something like this. One of the first experiments I needed to work on was exactly what kind of power are you getting from particular springs. The big problem with springs is that they don't have any kind of nomenclature. Some manufacturers will paint the springs, but it's not like a universal system. So generally speaking, when you pull a spring out of a gun, you can't just look at it and go, oh, yeah, that's an M130. Well, you know, there's no way to really look at it and determine that. So I needed a way to be able to take just sort of a generic spring and figure out what kind of power that spring had. I decided to go by the amount of weight that it takes in order to compress the spring. In order to do that, I sort of built this little contraption here where it's got, this is just a metal rod. This is actually a rod from an AK-47. I put a spring guide from an Airsoft gearbox on that rod, so I'm able to put the spring onto the spring guide. And then this is just an old piston from a gearbox, so that goes over it, so everything is held together. And then what I can do is hook this onto, this is just like a fish scale, what you use to weigh a fish when you catch it. Has a digital readout, so I'm able to compress the spring and determine what kind of weight it takes in order to fully compress the spring. And what I essentially did was took a number of springs that I knew what the value of them was. I took a couple of M120s, 130s, and so on, and weighed a number of them and came up with the range of weights that it took in order to compress the spring. So I've got those results for you. So these results were within a range of weights. The M100 was 14 to 18 pounds, the M110 was 18 to 21 pounds, the M120 was 21 to 24 pounds, the M130 was 24 to 28 pounds, the 140 was 28 to 32 pounds, and the M150 was 32 to 37 pounds. So you can use these weights to sort of analyze your existing spring to determine what kind of weight you're working with. So if you use the system that I showed you earlier with the scale weighing your spring, then you can come to a place like this and say, look, I'm getting 300 feet per second and I've got a spring that's 14 to 18 pounds, so it's an M100, and then we'll be able to know pretty quickly what kind of spring you're going to need to get whatever velocity you're looking for. So once I was able to quantify what springs am I working with, I then needed to figure out what kind of velocity am I getting with those springs. So I needed a platform to test them on that was as close to a factory stock setup, with having the added benefit of being able to change springs quickly in it. So I chose a JG gearbox, which had a quick release spring, so I'm able to just simply remove the spring right out the back of the gearbox. But I did use, this is mostly G&G factory stock parts, so it's got a G&G cylinder piston, although I did upgrade the piston to a metal rack gear because we were using higher value springs than M120s, and I also went with G&G gears, which I find are probably the best factory stock gears that are out there. In fact, I would put their standard OEM gears against some of the upgrade ones that are out there because they're just that good. The other component I needed for this experiment was a good high torque motor. I started off with a couple of standard OEM motors and burned those out within a couple thousand shots, so I ended up upgrading to a high torque motor. I think I burned out 2 KWA high torque motors before I ended up using another one that one of the guys here had upgraded. So it's important to know that if you are upgrading springs, that it's going to put a lot of stress on that motor, so you're going to want to get yourself a decent motor in your gun to be able to handle all that additional stress. The other component in this experiment was the barrel. We started off with a 500 millimeter barrel, which is pretty much the longest length I would recommend for an airsoft gun. I've found that beyond a 500 millimeter barrel, it begins to adversely affect your range, your accuracy, and your velocity. Up to a 500 millimeter barrel, you're going to be accelerating the BB, so you'll get higher velocities. Beyond that, it seems like the resistance of the barrel begins to slow the BB down, and you begin to lose accuracy and velocity. So a 500 millimeter barrel is pretty much the maximum that I would recommend. What I did was measure it off in 100 millimeter lengths so that I could cut the barrel down as I went. So we started with the 500 millimeter, and you'll find as that barrel gets shorter and shorter, the velocities are going to begin to get slower and slower. So that is one of the important reasons why we need to know what length of barrel you're going to use. It's also important to know the diameter of the barrel, whether it's a tight bore or not, because the first run of this experiment, I used a tight bore barrel, and I compared the results that I got with other results that I saw on the internet, and I was like, why are my readings so much higher than everybody else? And then when I finally figured it out, I had been using a tight bore barrel, so my results were skewed as a result. And I will post those results as well for those of you that are out there using tight bore barrels. But for those of you, which pretty much constitutes the majority of people out there, are going to have standard bore barrels. So starting with a 500 millimeter barrel, with an M100 spring, we got 320 to 340 feet per second. With an M110, we got 340 to 350 feet per second. With an M120, we got 350 to 365 feet per second. With an M130, we got 365 to 420. With an M140, we got 420 to 475 feet per second. And with an M150, we got 475 to 495 feet per second, which was kind of funny that I noticed when I looked at these results compared to what I had seen on the internet. These were pretty much spot on what most of the websites were showing in their charts as far as what kind of velocities you get with particular springs, although their results were much narrower, where they were saying it was specifically 300 feet per second, or not within a certain range. But it struck me as kind of odd that the results that they were posting was pretty much the most optimistic with the longest barrel that's out there, which is probably not going to be the most common, since a lot of guys are using carbine length barrels. Not everybody's going to be using a 500 millimeter barrel. So as we cut the barrel down, we went down to a 400 millimeter barrel. So we basically chopped it down, re-crowned the barrel, repolished it, and then ran the same test again. So with a 400 millimeter barrel and an M100 spring, we got 300 to 335 feet per second. With an M110, we got 335 to 345 feet per second. With an M120 spring, we got 345 to 360 feet per second. With an M130 spring, we got 360 to 415. With an M140, we got 415 to 465 feet per second. And with an M150 spring, we got 465 to 490 feet per second. Once again, we took the barrel, cut another 100 millimeters off, recrowned it, and ran the same test again. With an M100 spring, we got 280 to 320 feet per second. With an M110, we got 320 to 340 feet per second. With an M120, we got 340 to 355 feet per second. With an M130, we got 355 to 410 feet per second. With an M140, we got 410 to 460 feet per second. And with an M150, we got 460 to 485 feet per second. Again, we cut 100 millimeters off the barrel, recrowned it, and ran the experiment again. So with a 200 millimeter barrel and an M100 spring, we got 270 to 310 feet per second. With an M110, we got 310 to 330 feet per second. With an M120, we got 330 to 350. With a 130, we got 350 to 400 feet per second. With an M140, we got 400 to 450 feet per second. And with an M150, we got 450 to 460 feet per second. So we then cut another 100 millimeters off of the barrel, and we're down to a 100 millimeter barrel, which is pretty common for what you're going to see on most super short, like CQB M4s and stuff like that. With a 100 millimeter barrel and an M100 spring, we got 230 to 250 feet per second. With a 110, we got 250 to 275. With a 120, we got 275 to 290. With a 130, we got 290 to 320. With a 140, we got 320 to 340, and with a M150 spring, we got 340 to 365 feet per second. So you can see as the barrel length gets shorter, the velocity gets lower. So it's impossible to get super high velocities with a short CQB sized barrel on your airsoft gun. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we did the same test initially using a tight bore barrel, and I found that the results were 20 to 30 feet per second higher than we got with the standard bore barrel. So I know this is a lot of information to digest all at once, so what I'm going to do is post the results of all of our tests on the website so you can use this as a reference in the future if you're looking to figure out what spring you need to get a particular velocity. Of course, there are other variables in adjusting the velocity on your gun. You can get different cylinder heads, different piston heads, different amounts of O-rings, different O-ring configurations. You can get different cylinder configurations with bore-up cylinders and larger piston heads for that sort of thing. So there's a number of other variables that are involved in the velocity and the accuracy of your gun, and hopefully we'll be able to cover some more of these things as we go forward in the future. So take a look at the data, see if you can use it to help you out. If all this seems a little confusing to you and you need some help with it, feel free to bring your gun down here to the shop and we'll be glad to take a few minutes with you and get you the proper spring to get you the results that you're looking for. So hopefully we'll see you soon, and we'll do more of these videos on improving the accuracy and velocity and all that stuff of airsoft guns in the future. So stay tuned for that. And until the next time, don't let the bastards get you down.